Hi, everyone. I'm just letting more folks populate, and then we'll get started in just a couple moments. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jackie from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event, Authors in Conversation, Jewish Literature in the 20th Century, featuring Adam Kirsch and The Blessing and the Curse, Jewish People and Their Books in the 20th Century, and Ruth Franklin presenting A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Adam and Ruth and the team at Norton for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here, and we're so grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. The exact location depends on what type of device you are using. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and to interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by either of the authors, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A tonight to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look out for the audio and video versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured books, The Blessing and the Curse and A Thousand Darknesses, are available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations 12 to 7 p.m. every day of the week, or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store and for shipping anywhere in the US. If you care about supporting the careers of authors like Ruth and Adam, and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores like Greenlight, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. So our featured authors tonight, as I mentioned before, are Adam Kirsch and Ruth Franklin. Adam Kirsch is the author of several books of poetry and criticism, including Who Wants to Be a Jewish Writer and The People and the Books, 18 Classics of Jewish Literature. A 2016 Guggenheim Fellow, Kirsch is an editor at the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Review. His new book, The Blessing and the Curse, is an erudite and accessible survey of Jewish life and culture in the 20th century, as reflected in seminal texts. With discussions of major books by over 30 writers, he argues that literature offers a new way to think about what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. Ruth Franklin is a book critic, a biographer, and a former editor at the New Republic. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Biography, a Coleman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a Leon Levy Fellowship in Biography, and the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism. Her biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, won the National Book of Critics Circle Award for Biography, among numerous other honors. Her 2011 book, A Thousand Darknesses, examines the question, do narratives about the Holocaust have a special obligation to be faithful to the facts of history, and makes a persuasive case for literature as a vehicle equal to memoir for understanding the Holocaust. Adam and Ruth are going to start us off with a discussion, so please take it away, Adam and Ruth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's so much fun to be here at Greenlight Bookstore, as it were. Adam, we've known each other for a long time, but I actually can't think of another time that we have sat down and talked about these questions about Jewish literature that obviously have preoccupied both of us for so much of our writing career. So I'm excited to have this opportunity to get to kind of explore things more deeply with you.
Yes, me too.
And so I thought we could just start off with, regarding your new book. What was it that inspired you to take this approach of, looking at these kind of snapshots of so many different Jewish texts from, different moments in contemporary history, different geographic locations, and so on?
Well, a few years ago, I wrote a book called The People and the Books, which was about ancient Jewish texts, really starting in biblical times and going up to the late 19th century. And in that book, I devoted sort of in-depth analysis to 18 individual books, most of which are things that readers today don't read or maybe know the names of the titles, but have never actually opened up and gone into. And for each of those, I went into a lot of detail for each individual book. And I thought if I ever sort of wanted to continue this sort of survey of Jewish literature into the 20th century, it would have to be a different approach because the 20th century is much more familiar to us. It's the books and the events are things that we sort of know and that have shaped our world in a way that more distant periods haven't. And really the sort of three big themes or four big themes of the book, starting in the early 20th century, are things that I think still shape the Jewish world today. So you could say that maybe the 21st century is still part of the 20th century, or we're still living in that same era. And so the
long
book
20th century, as it were.
Exactly, the long 20th century. So the book is divided into sections on Europe, America, Israel, and then a section basically about God, about theology and religion, and looking at how various writers thought about these subjects and interpreted those experiences. So it's a little bit of a history through literature. Rather than going in great depth into each individual book, I'm looking at a survey saying, how can we put all these books together and find out something about what the Jewish experience was like over those 100 years?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting that you and I both have kind of spent a lot of the last 20 years sort of circling around this question of Jewish literature in different ways, writing about it from different angles. And I wonder if it's always been a longstanding interest of yours, or was it something that, did you grow up reading Jewish books? I know your father's a book critic, so I'm going to guess that maybe you did.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we can talk about this. I'd like to know your experience as well. I mean, I really think that I grew up in a conservative synagogue and got a pretty good Jewish education and read the sort of classic Jewish books. But then as I got older, became a teenager and then a college student, I really didn't feel particularly drawn to Jewish literature. It wasn't something that excited me, maybe because I felt like I knew Jewishness and Judaism in my own life, and I wanted to go into other areas and find out new things. And also, I think that when you're educated, as we all are in America, in English language literature, most of it doesn't have anything to do with Jews up until the fairly recent past. And the sort of the main action doesn't seem to be in Jewish literature, it's elsewhere. So I think that when I sort of first started out as an adult reader and writer, it wasn't what I was drawn to, it wasn't what I wanted to explore. And that really changed as I got older into my 20s and started to see how much being Jewish really did affect the way I understood books and events and ideas, and that you can't really abstract yourself away from your own experience. I mean, I think that as a Jewish American reader, you see things and understand things in a particular way, and you have to take account of that. And I wonder if the same thing is true for you. I mean, did you feel like you always wanted to be a critic of Jewish literature?
I mean, no, no way. And I mean, if you had said that to me as a teenager, like I've joked before, people say that nobody ever grows up dreaming of becoming a book critic, but I think maybe I did. Like if it had occurred to me that it was a possibility that I could read books and write about them as a job, which I was totally unaware of as a child, that's what I would have wanted. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in some ways in a similar environment to yours. I was bat mitzvahed in a conservative synagogue. But my parents actually weren't very engaged in Jewish life. And in fact, my father, for a lot of my childhood, was married to a non-Jewish woman who was deeply influential on me. So I sort of, in some ways, I grew up in kind of in a mixed religion home. And, I would say I felt a certain amount of, of obligation towards Jewish literature in a way that I think many Jews of our generation were brought up with. And part of that had to do with my mother's parents being Holocaust survivors. And so there was always, from the time I was a very small child, I don't remember a time when I didn't know about the Holocaust or, wasn't reading about the Holocaust. And all of that comes with such a heavy dose, a heavy burden of carrying on the memory of it, that I think, it's natural for us as somewhat as rebellious teenagers to want to resist that for a certain, period of time at least. And, so I grew up, I think some of the first Jewish writers I read were probably like Chaim Potok, for sure. I remember reading The Chosen as a child. Did you read The Chosen as a child?
I did, but I have very little memory of it, but my son is reading it this year in his English class.
Oh, that's so interesting. And how old is your son?
He's in 8th grade.
Okay, so both of my kids received The Chosen as a bar and bat mitzvah gift from their synagogue. But my impression is that kids don't really read it anymore. So I'm surprised and interested to hear that your son was assigned it in an English class. I mean,
Yeah.
for sure, I was never assigned any Jewish book in a class. It's
Yeah.
not in high school, not in college, with the exception of Holocaust literature.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know if that changed. But when I think about the Jewish writers who I read as a child, Chaim Potok, Philip Roth, who I have a very distinct memory of taking down Portnoy's Complaint from a shelf in the library at an age when it was totally inappropriate for me to be doing so. And we're kind of furtively reading along in it in the stacks for a little while, and then like literally placing it back on the shelf, kind of feeling like this is more than I need to know right now about the male species, like
Right.
more than I can handle. And of course, Elie Wiesel, who also was, literally put into my hands when I was a pretty young child. And, looking at those three writers, it strikes me that, thinking about kind of how our identities, I like what you said about, abstracting yourself away from identifying with the work. And I think the tendency now among readers and among critics is, to search for reflections of one's own experience, one's own identity,
Yeah.
in what's being read and discussed. And I'm struck that, in those books, what I would have seen was something that didn't relate in any way to my own experience of being Jewish.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that there's been a big change in our lifetimes, really, I think in just the time of our generation, that if you look at some of these older Jewish writers, some of whom I write about in the book, like Philip Roth is a good example, or Saul Bellow, the last thing they wanted was to be considered Jewish writers. And in fact, even someone like Roth, who is so, thoroughly and inescapably Jewish, and basically that's all he writes about, there's a PBS documentary about him several years ago, and it starts out with him saying, "I'm not a Jewish writer, I'm an American writer." And Saul Bellow said, "I'm being a Jewish writer is like saying someone is like a Zulu Gainsborough expert. Like it has nothing to do with the subject matter, it has something to do with what I actually do. It's just a biographical fact." So these writers, I think, coming from this immigrant background, Saul Bellow was a first-generation American, and Roth was a second-generation American. They really felt like there was this great big world out there of experience and literature, and where we come from is like a ghetto, and we want to break out of the ghetto and get into the big time. And that meant not identifying as a Jewish writer, or sort of writing about Jewishness because that was what interested them and it's what they knew, but not wanting to have that label and classification. And I think that for writers our age, that's totally changed. I mean, if you look at the big Jewish novelists who are now in their 40s, people like Jonathan Safran Foer, Nicole Krauss, or Joshua Cohen. Yeah, Nathan Englander. They are very much about being Jewish, and they're much more interested in Judaism as a religion than anyone like Bellow and Roth ever was. They're interested in texts and prayers and things like that in the past would have seemed very out of date. And I think that a lot of that has to do with multiculturalism. It has to do with the idea that it's not just there's this WASP literary tradition and everyone's trying to break into it, but in fact, everyone has their own traditions, everyone has their own voice, and we're all trying to speak about individual experiences. So the Jewish experience is just as important as any other. But of course, the flip side of that is that Bellow and Roth managed to be read by very large audiences. And I don't think that's necessarily true of a lot of the best Jewish writers today.
Yeah, that's an really interesting point. I mean, what I'm struck by is how American both of those impulses are. I mean, the idea that, and there's so many wonderful examples in your book of the different ways in which writers wrestle with the idea of being labeled as Jewish writers when, they simply wanted to write literature, full stop, rather than Jewish literature, and kind of the trap, the pigeonhole that they felt that they were inevitably put in, with the assumption being that that's the goal to strive for, right? The perfect assimilation into the American canon when there's no adjective attached to their name. And that was kind of the ideal of their era. And then flip it to now when, as you say, there's been this rise of multiculturalism, for the last 30 years or so since we came of age. And so the Jewish writers' sense of, holding on to what separates them, what makes them distinct from the general American public, if we even accept the idea that there is still such a thing as the general American public, right?
Yeah.
But neither of those is in any way a Jewish impulse. It's simply reflective of the trend of what's going on politically in America.
Yeah.
That the writers are reacting to.
Well, one thing that struck me in reading some of these earlier American Jewish books, going back to The Rise of David Levinsky by Abraham Kahn, which was published in 1917, and it's sometimes thought of as the first American Jewish novel, is that these early immigrants, Kahn himself was an immigrant. He came to America in the 1880s and was the longtime editor of the Forward, the Yiddish socialist newspaper. And he wrote this novel about a Jewish businessman. And one of the themes of the novel is that that first generation of immigrants were very happy to just dump it all overboard. They were not really worried about maintaining the traditions, keeping them alive. In that novel, David Levinsky, on the very first day he gets off the boat, he gets his payas shaved off. And that's sort of the first step towards forgetting everything he knew about the Talmud. He was a Talmud scholar in the old country. And I think that was really true for like 90% plus of American Jews. And I'm thinking of Ashkenazi Jews who immigrated in that period between 1880 and 1920, when most American Jews' ancestors can sort of trace back to, including mine, that they were very happy to become American. They didn't feel necessarily like they were giving things up. They really felt like they were gaining things. And that was especially true of the first native-born generation. And there's always been a sort of incoherence in American Judaism, except for the Orthodox Judaism, less so with Orthodox Judaism. But for the 90% of Jews who are not Orthodox, there's always been this sort of question of, so we don't speak a Jewish language, we don't live in a Jewish community, we don't necessarily believe in Judaism. So what is it that keeps us being Jewish? How do we make sense of this identity? We don't have any of the things that being Jewish meant for the last 2,000 years, so why are we still Jews at all? And that's something that American Jewish literature has always been struggling with and wrestling with, and still does. But a lot of the great writers of the 20th century, the American Jewish canon, from Abe Kahn all the way down to Tony Kushner, are thinking about that. They're saying, what does this mean? It's sort of this empty label, and we have to fill it with some kind of meaning. I mean, one thing that strikes me as a key sort of turning point in that is the Holocaust, that the Holocaust gave Jewish identity a meaning that it didn't have before. And I know that this is something that you've been studying for a very long time. Do you see a sort of impact of the Holocaust in America fairly soon, or does it take time to translate?
I don't know if this is audible to people who are listening to us. You're breaking up a little bit, so I didn't hear the entirety of what you last said. I think you said, does it translate fairly quickly to the American Jewish literary experience, or did it take longer?
Yes, that's right.
And yeah, I think that, this is a fascinating question, the impact that the Holocaust had on American Jewry in general and American Jewish literature in particular. And it's funny, I think in some ways we really are only beginning to understand what it meant, even 70 years on now. It's one thing that is so striking about your book is that there are no post-war European Jewish writers in it. And that just, that tells the whole story. There was this, this split, this divide after the Holocaust. Some of them went to Israel and some of them went to America. And the ones, there were Jewish writers who stayed in Europe. There's Paul Celan, for instance, but it's hard to think. It's hard to think of another figure as even close to his importance, who is a Jewish European post-war writer. First of all, it had the effect of splitting the canon in that way, and you have two diverse groups of writers and readers who, for the most part, don't really speak to each other. Some of the books are translated, and there's a certain amount of dialogue between, I think, the most well-known Israeli authors, Amos Oz or Alfred Yehoshua, but in general, these aspects of the literary world developed, totally heterogeneously. At least that's how I see it. And I don't know, you may have a different argument to make about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true. And the Israelis I've talked to all say we never read any of these American Jewish writers when we were growing up. We never read Bellow or Roth in school. These were not part of our horizon at all. And they just felt like this is not speaking to our experience.
Right, and that's symptomatic, of course, of a larger political and cultural divide that exists between American Jews and Israeli Jews. So I think, I think that's the first concrete impact. I mean, the second impact, obviously, is that the Holocaust was this, disaster of seismic proportions that had trickle-down effects and is still having trickle-down effects on further generations that we still don't really understand. And of course, all that is reflected in the literature in different ways. So some of it, I think, gets picked up in this late 20th century drive towards, multiculturalism and emphasizing different aspects of American immigrant experience. And of course, the experience of Jews whose parents were survivors and who came over, shortly after the war was, in some ways was a typical immigrant experience, and in other ways was totally different in terms of the kinds of trauma and, the different kinds of familial dysfunction that they experienced. And so I think there's, one thing we haven't talked about that I'd like to talk about is this sort of, for lack of a better way to describe it, like this culture of neurosis that has been created and sort of nurtured in Jewish writing. This feeling that there is almost like a neurotic Jewish cultural sensibility that, is somehow what defines us and defines our writing. And I think the impact of the Holocaust had a lot to do with kind of the penetration of that into our culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to early experiences, one of the things that I really reacted against as a teenager was the whole Woody Allen, Philip Roth portrayal of Jewish men. I sort of resented it and thought, all these neuroses and the sexual neuroses and the self-hatred and and feeling like you're neurotic and cut off from everything. To me, I sort of resented it and it didn't feel like the portrayal of any of the Jews that I knew or the community I knew, partly maybe because I was growing up in Los Angeles, which has a totally different culture and ethos than New York. But I think it's true that one thing that the Holocaust did was it took away the idea of an old country. And that reinforces the difference between Jews and every other kind of American immigrant, that if you're an Italian American or Irish American or whatever, there's an old country and it's going on in sort of a parallel path. And your story has been translated from the old country to America. Now you're an American and you might go back to the old country for a visit or see relatives or sightseeing. But you don't feel responsible for continuing what it means to be Italian or what it means to be Irish, because that's someone else's job. Whereas for Ashkenazi Jews, it's all gone. There's nothing left. And so there's this responsibility, the sense of responsibility to, if we're not going to continue this heritage, then it's going to disappear completely. And it ties Jews to the past in very intimate ways, and it does create a lot of guilt, I think. It creates a lot of guilt thinking that maybe there are traditions that we're not living up to, that we're not going to sustain. And it also, I think, creates guilt among American Jews vis-a-vis Israel and Israeli Jews, feeling like Israel is where the Jewish sort of destiny is really being worked out, and we're on the sidelines. We're not in the front lines of that battle. But one thing that's interesting from a literary point of view is that the Israeli novelists and poets who we think of as the great ones and the canonical ones are all the ones who question the national myth. There were plenty of early Hebrew writers and in that first generation of the state who sort of sustained the myths and wrote propagandistically about the Jewish state and the new Jew. But all the ones who sort of still mean things to people now, like Agnon and Oz and David Grossman, they're all people who say, we're supposed to be living in this great rebirth of the Jewish state, and we're supposed to be part of this new Jewish type. But what does it really feel like from the inside to be a part of that? And often the answers are that they're just as neurotic and scared and messed up as American Jews, but it takes different forms. I mean, that's one of the big subjects for Oz, is that he lives on this kibbutz. He lived on a kibbutz for many, many years, for decades. And the whole point of the kibbutz was, we're going to bring Jews back in contact with the soil, and they'll be strong and silent, and they won't have all these neuroses from the diaspora. But his books are all about how, when you look very closely at what's going on in the kibbutz, there's all kinds of mishigas, and you sort of can't escape it. It's just, they don't admit it, it's buried. It's not celebrated the way it is in American Jewish literature.
Right, I think that's one of the paradoxes of our heritage as Jewish intellectuals, that we're brought up at the same time with this culture, this idea of obligation to the culture of the past, the history of the Jews as a people, and yet at the same time we're also taught that part of what it means to be Jewish is to be skeptical and ask questions about everything, and to question all, even the basics of that tradition. So I think it's sort of a perfect recipe for the elevation of writers, as you say, like Oz, Agnon, like Roth and Bellow, who are not going to toe the party line, the establishment religion line on what it's like to be what it's like to be a Jew in America, or what it's supposed to be like. But I wonder also, about the Holocaust. What kind of impact it must have that probably for the majority of Americans, Anne Frank's diary is going to be the first Jewish book that they ever read, and maybe the last, right?
Yeah, and there, I talk a bit about Anne Frank's diary, and in particular, in parallel with the diary of Hannah Senesh, who was almost the same age as Anne Frank and also kept a diary, but became a very different kind of figure. And I know you're working on a biography of Anne Frank right now. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's more of an essay type book than a proper biography. But yeah, it's biographical components. Yeah.
Well, so one thing that I sort of write about is that Anne Frank is the perfect universal Jewish spokesperson. Not that she set out to be that, of course, because she didn't, and she didn't ever anticipate that anyone would even read her diary other than herself. And it's only through a sort of remarkable chain of accidents that it was preserved and that it became the book that it is today. But one of the reasons why that is, I think, is that she is someone for whom being Jewish is something that's affixed to her from the outside. It sort of determines her life and determines the end of her life. But she writes in the book, when are people going to realize that, when are people going to stop seeing me as a Jew and realize that I'm just a teenage girl who wants to have a good time, in one of the entries. And the things that she's interested in are like the movie star pictures on the wall, or the royal family of Holland, where she lives. And she's not really interested in, and never talks about, Zionism or Judaism. And there's a scene, I think, where Albert Dussel, the man who's not related to them, is praying, and she writes about it in this way that suggests that it's something that she's seldom seen, or maybe never seen someone praying. So when you read the Diary of Anne Frank, if you're someone who's not Jewish, and even someone who's not of a European background at all, like in Japan where it's very popular. It's a story about, oh, this is a person who is just like everyone else, and for some arbitrary reason she's been singled out and punished, and it's a very easy story to relate to because basically any secular Western person can imagine themselves being Anne Frank. Whereas Hannah Senesh, who was a few years older than Anne Frank and born in Budapest, decided at a certain point when she was about 17 that she was going to be a Zionist, and she moved to Palestine in 1939, right when actually after the war, World War II had started. She managed to get a visa to go to Palestine, and she lived on a kibbutz and trained to be a laborer there and lived there for about 4 years, and then volunteered for a mission that was going to recruit Jewish soldiers from Palestine to parachute back into Nazi-occupied Europe under the sort of auspices of the British Army. The idea was that they were going to help downed RAF pilots. And for her, what she really wanted to do was infiltrate herself back into Hungary and possibly even find her mother, because her mother had been left behind in Hungary, which was now occupied by the Nazis. And she was almost immediately captured and tortured and then killed. And her diary and some poems that she wrote are very well known in Israel. They're sort of national, part of the national curriculum, but basically unknown anywhere else, because they're all about someone saying, my role in history and my identity is about being a Jew and a Zionist, and I'm going to face this experience by fighting for a Jewish state. So it's a very particularistic response to the Holocaust, saying, I'm not going to emphasize what I have in common with everyone else, but I'm going to say this proves that I am different from other people and that I have to accept them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. I mean, yeah, regarding Anne Frank, I mean, I think, yeah, of course you're right that so much of what has made the diary so popular and helped it endure is that, in so many ways she is a typical teenage girl, at least, that's the way she presents herself. And yet, in so many other ways, she's not. And, in many, of course, the fact that the diary was found and published is in some ways an accident of history, but also does reflect a certain amount of intentionality on her part, because as I'm sure you remember, she actually edited the diary for publication and intended to publish it in some form, perhaps as a novel, perhaps as something more like what it was after the war. And she did that in response to hearing on the radio the Dutch government calling for citizens to preserve their documents from the war years, like letters and diaries, in the hope of creating a national archive after the war with an understanding already of how significant the documents that were being created at that moment were. And heard this and rewrote her diary from the beginning. So that, the diary as we know it is more properly thought of actually as like a memoir in diary form, rather than, the way we conventionally think of a diary as something we sit down, we write from day to day and chronological order. And it's interesting to see the way, a lot of the things that she presents about herself, including her relationship to Judaism, change among the different versions. And then, the diary that we know is kind of an amalgamation of the pages that she edited, while they were still in hiding, and then the changes that her father made to it after the war. So, as you know, he's been kind of demonized and vilified as, somebody who censored her honest thoughts about her relationship with her mother or her sexuality and all that. And, in fact, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because, first of all, and I'm sure, if you read the diary today, you'll see that it's an extremely different experience to read it when one is our age and has children who are Anne Frank's age or close to it, than it is to read it, when you're Anne Frank's age, when most people read it. And, I found myself, of course, like all great works of literature, you find yourself on the sides of different characters, on different reads through it. And these days I find myself deeply, deeply sympathetic with Otto Frank, who, it's simply impossible to imagine what he went through surviving Auschwitz and coming back to the Netherlands and finding that of the 8 people who were in hiding, including his wife and his 2 daughters, he was the only one who survived. And the idea of having that experience and then being presented with your daughter's diary just, strikes me as unspeakable, right? It's just impossible to imagine what that must have been like for him. And so, I'm inclined to be very gentle indeed in criticizing the kinds of edits that he made, but especially also because Anne herself was such a careful constructor of her own voice, and paid such close attention to the idea that of exactly what she wanted to include. For instance, she wanted to take out her whole romance with Peter Van Pels. Because by the time she was rewriting the diary, she had her crush on him had dissipated, and she didn't think it was important anymore. But her father recognized that that was exactly part of what makes her so appealing as a figure, right? What makes her seem so universal, and makes her experience so easy for so many people to identify with, the fact that she actually fell in love and documented it while she was in hiding. And so there's also stuff about her Jewish observance, her ideas about Judaism, stuff that they did as a family before they were in hiding or after, that wound up getting left out of the final version. And some of that was because Otto Frank took it out again as a way of making the diary more universally appealing. And as you know, Elie Wiesel also did similar changes to his memoir, Night, in the long process of getting that book published. What once started out as an 800 plus page Yiddish manuscript that was full of political vituperation against the way the world had abandoned the European Jews was, radically compressed and slimmed down into this, little book that's less than 200 pages, and, very, very starkly and simply and, more effectively written, but also one that's in its own way much less Jewish. It sounds silly. Obviously, it's ridiculous to say that Night is in any way not a Jewish book, but looking at it, you can see the ways in which it was made to be more relatable to the non-Jewish reader.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question that you write about in your book, is when you're writing literature about a personal experience or historical experience, does it stop being testimony? Does it become a work of literature? And how do you draw the sort of boundary between those two? I definitely think that, and I write about this a bit in the book, that Anne Frank is someone who seems like she would have been a writer, that if she had survived, she would have been a writer. And in fact, that's the premise of Philip Roth's great novel, The Ghost Writer, in which he sort of fantasizes about meeting an Anne Frank who survived the war. But as you say, those stories that diary is shaped and extremely literary. She sets up scenes. She'll have scenes with titles, as if she were writing a play, and she'll build up suspenseful moments and have cliffhangers. And she is clearly practicing what it's like to be a writer. And she, by making the diary addressed to Kitty, right, an anonymous, sort of invented audience, it gives her practice in writing for an audience. So it's not just writing notes for herself, it's really sort of writing some kind of literary document, which is not the case with Hannah Senesh, whose diary is much less interesting for that reason. It's much more about what I did today. That has its own kind of interest. But what you're saying about Otto Frank's censoring things reminds me of my own first encounter with the Diary of Anne Frank, which was that when I was sleeping over at a friend's house, when I was probably 10 or 11, his mother was reading to us from it. And I noticed that she was skipping things. I noticed, I could see that she was skipping things from the book, and I noticed the parts that she was skipping were the parts about her body changing, and the passage about how she's talking about her body changing. So my friend's mother thought that the two of us boys didn't need to hear about that quite yet. So yeah, and imagine having to fulfill that task. One of the things that Roth does in The Ghostwriter is he imagines Anne Frank having escaped and come to America and changed her identity, seeing her own book or having ordered it from Amsterdam before it had been translated, and getting a copy of the Dutch book and thinking about her pride of authorship and how she would have felt about it as a writer. So I think that he also felt that this was a literary work, not just a work of testimony.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, thinking about also, I see that we're starting to get close to the time to turn to questions, but before we do, just the idea of this, everybody's writing for an audience, obviously, and the question of who Anne Frank pictured her audience to be, who Wiesel was thinking of his audience, just leaves me thinking about how has the audience for these books changed over the last, I don't know, 70, 100 years, right? Is there a way to kind of generalize about the addressee of Jewish literature?
It's a good question. I mean, one thing that struck me is that between, I think, 1950 and 1970, something like 12 of the 20 National Book Award winners were Jewish writers. So that was the period when Roth and Bellow and Malamud were racking up all those prizes. So there was this moment, this sort of 20 years, when American literature was Jewish literature in a weird way. And you can see that non-Jewish writers didn't like it, and they reacted against it in various ways. Like Gore Vidal was very hostile to Jews and Jewish writing. John Updike created this character of Beck, Henry Beck, as sort of a fictional Jewish writer. And he once said, I made Beck a Jewish writer the same way you would make a rug salesman Armenian, because it's just like writers are Jews. That's just the way it is. So it was a little bit of a snobbery on his part. And it's interesting to speculate about why that is. Irving Howe has an essay, I think it's called Shadows, where he says, it's very strange to think that Jews would become thought of as great writers of fiction because there was really no tradition of Jewish fiction writing before the late 19th century. It was just not a genre that was important for Jews. It started in Yiddish in the late 19th century and then sort of burst into life in America in the 20th century. And that he says there's this great incompatibility between the Jewish sensibility and the American romantic sensibility. And yet so many of these Jewish writers were drawn to the romantics. Bellow and Alfred Kazin certainly really hero worship them. So it's the real question is sort of, to me, is less why Americans are less interested in reading Jewish writing now, or whether Jewish writing is less attracted to Americans now, as to then why was there this anomaly? Why was there this 20-year period when so many people were interested in what Jews had to say? And obviously the Holocaust is a big part of that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I mean, in some ways it seems unfair to single out Jews as coming, more lately to fiction writing, because the novel is itself such a young form that, there's no culture that has an extremely long tradition of novel writing. And of course, Jews have a tradition of oral storytelling, just like so many other cultures. But yeah, I mean, looking ahead, books like yours are kind of canon setting books, right? What do you think the Jewish canon of, how do you think things are going to change in the next 20, 50 years? Is the Jewish canon going to, considerably different from the way it does now?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I didn't set out to, as people who write books like this always say, I didn't set out to define a canon, and I really didn't set out to define a canon. I was thinking about books that are well-known and or illustrate sort of certain Jewish experiences in a good way. And almost all the books that I write about are by Ashkenazi Jews. So that was another decision, that it represents really a story about Jews who began in Eastern Europe and ended up in other places. So one thing that I think a book like this tries to do is change the perspective of Jewish readers about what kind of story they're a part of. For me, I think a big part of coming to consciousness as a Jewish writer and just as a Jew is understanding that the whole modern Jewish experience is not very old. And that if you go back, say, 140 years, 90% of Jews in America and and maybe half of the Jews in Israel all of their ancestors lived in Eastern Europe, and they all lived in a very different culture than the ones that we know now. And so what I like to try to do, and what I think literature can help us do, is think about how we got from there to here. How did we go from the towns and cities and villages of Eastern Europe and the traditional religious culture and Yiddish and Hebrew to the very different world that we live in now? Now, obviously, that's not just a Jewish story, because if you look at any culture, it was very different 200 years ago. I mean, that's really the modern story also. It's the story of going from the pre-modern world to the modern world. But that happened in such a dramatic way for Jews for various reasons, one of which is the Holocaust, one of which is the state of Israel. It involves such great language change and cultural change and religious change that it's very hard to see that as a continuity. And I think we don't usually think of American Jewish writers and Israeli Jewish writers and European Jewish writers as all part of the same genre or the same group in a certain way. But I think if you put people side by side like that, and if you look at, Kafka and Tony Kushner and David Grossman all as part of one group, that some interesting things can emerge.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so I'm looking at the Q&A, and I'll just remind everybody we are taking questions, so feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we will take a look. And we have some interesting comments here from our friend David Greenberg. Hi, David.
Hi, David.
So nice to see these questions. Okay, he says, to us, they're Jewish writers who didn't think of themselves as Jewish, but obviously are, Bellow and Roth. Right? We can debate whether do they really not think of themselves as Jewish, right? You mean they didn't think of themselves as Jewish writers, okay? But what about Jewish writers who aren't obviously Jewish? Okay, does the absence of Jewish themes in their work deprive them of status in the 20th century Jewish canon? And David cites Dorothy Parker, maybe. Okay, I didn't even know that Dorothy Parker was Jewish. Did you know that? Probably you did know that.
I think it rings a bell.
Paul Auster might be a good example. Okay, I also didn't know that Paul Auster was Jewish. Is he a Jewish writer or a writer who happens to be Jewish? Well, like the writer who's debated about this, essentially is Kafka, right? Was Kafka a Jewish writer, or was he a writer who happened to be Jewish? Where would you come down on that question?
Yeah, I mean, Kafka is a perfect example because the optical illusion where it's a duck and a rabbit. Like if you read Kafka and you didn't know he was Jewish, you might not even know. You might never pick up on it from the book. The word Jew never appears in his books. And the characters, of course, are very stylized. The settings are very stylized. So they take place in a sort of Central European city, and it's a very anonymous person. You never learn their last name, so you don't know what kind of name is K. So from one point of view, there are books about everyman, and that's the way they were received and have been received by people around the world who thought he was a prophet of totalitarianism or of bureaucratic society, and he had these deep insights into what was coming in the 20th century. On the other hand, if you do know that he was Jewish and you know something about his life, and in fact was very interested in Jewish subjects and followed the Yiddish theater, and at the end of his life was learning Hebrew because he wanted to think about moving to Palestine, then you can see some of those stories as very obvious parables about Jewish experience, like the report to an academy about an ape who is trained to resemble a human being and act like a human being is a sort of classic story about assimilation, even though the word Jew or Jewish is never used in it. In my book, I talk about the trial and how this idea that you've been accused of a crime, you don't know what it is, you don't know how to change it, but everyone is out to pass judgment on you, and in the end they're going to kill you and there's nothing you can do about it, is absolutely the experience of Jews in Eastern Europe in the 20s when Kafka died.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So it's really, he's almost doing it in a camouflage way, I think, where it's like a signal to some parts of the audience get it and some don't. And there's an interesting parallel there with Proust, who I don't write about in the book because he really is not as much of a Jewish writer in terms of what he's interested in. And yet, if you read Proust and you didn't know that his mother was Jewish, you might wonder, why is it that virtually everyone in this book is either Jewish or gay? Why does he know so many Jewish people, and why are they his best friends, and why is it such a big issue for him? It's obviously because he's Jewish, and he grew up in this milieu where the Dreyfus affair was sort of the defining issue of his life. But again, there's nothing in the book that says the narrator, Marcel, is Jewish. That's never actually spoken. So there is this sort of clandestine way of dealing with it.
That's interesting that Proust really got around this question. He got around the paradox of being a French Jewish writer. Nobody ever calls Proust a French Jewish writer, and yet that's what he was. So what, even though there are Jewish characters in his book, so what is it about Proust, do you think, that allows him to elude the modifier?
Yeah, it's a good question. One, I think, is that he was not actually Jewish. He was Catholic. I mean, he was raised Catholic, so he religiously was not Jewish. And I think that maybe because of the way he writes about Jews in the book, it's almost as though by creating the Jewish characters, it suggests that the Jewish characters are marked and everyone else is unmarked. And so, Bloch, his friend, who's sort of repulsive and awful, is Jewish, and Proust puts all the bad Jewish qualities onto Bloch. He's pushy, and he's a social climber, and things like that. And Charles Swann is Jewish. The sort of one of the main characters who we meet at the very beginning is Jewish, and yet he still socializes with the Prince of Wales, and he's supposed to be in the most elite circles. And then at the end of the novel, in the sort of very last scene, when the narrator meets everyone again after World War I and they're all old, and he reflects on how old they've gotten, he says that Swann now looks Jewish. He never used to, but it's like atavistically, his Jewish features have returned. So maybe he's saying, in the end, you can't escape it. One of the things that I thought in reading about Proust, that I thought was funny and interesting is that one of the running themes of the book is that the Duchess of Guermantes has this great sense of humor. She's very witty, and has these delightful conversations. And in one of the biographies, it says that the model for that character was a Jewish woman who was the mother of one of his friends. So what people around the world think of as the French aristocratic, esprit and wit is actually Jewish, but camouflaged and unidentified as such.
Interesting. Okay, we have a question from Jesse Bernstein. Could there be a communal reaction today on par to the rebuke that was given to Goodbye Columbus? Oh, nice one. And does that tell us something about the changes in the American Jewish community, Jewish literature, or something else? Okay, well, I mean, this question seems to assume that there wouldn't be. But, one thing that I can think of is the outcry around 20 years ago to Benjamin Wilkomirski's book Fragments, right, which was rebuked obviously for different reasons, but was universal. Well, first was, almost universally praised as this miraculously surviving memoir by somebody who had been a child in Auschwitz, I think, a child survivor of the Holocaust at any rate, and then was pretty quickly debunked as a fraud. And it turned out that the author hadn't been Jewish and was an Austrian, I think, raised by a Swiss foster family, and had kind of transmuted the trauma of his childhood onto the Holocaust. And that book was fiercely denounced before there was the kind of flood of false memoirs that started to appear in the beginning of the 2000s, right? Like James Fry's A Million Little Pieces, right? There's this whole series of controversial memoirs that were then proven not actually to be authentic memoirs. But putting aside debunking something for factual reasons like that, I mean, I guess what the question is really asking is, would the Jewish community kind of rise up as a whole against somebody who portrayed it in a negative light? And I think, I'm curious what you have to say about it, Adam, but I think at this point we're so used to Jews being portrayed in a negative light that what is more surprising is to actually read a book that portrays them positively. And I actually had an experience like this recently. I read a YA book by the author I think her name is Laura Amy Schlitz. Schmitz, maybe. I'll look it up. A book called The Hired Girl. That is about the experience of a historic work of historical fiction that takes place at the turn of the 20th century, and is about the experience of a non-Jewish girl who runs away from her abusive family and becomes a servant in the home of a very wealthy Jewish family in Baltimore, where I'm from. And at first, the first part of the book is all about this girl's experiences on her farm and her horrible father and all this stuff. And I read the whole first section. I knew that this book had won Jewish Book Awards, and I read this whole first section and thought, how is this a Jewish book? Am I reading the wrong book or something? And then obviously she makes contact with the Jewish family, and it's actually a very beautiful and warm and nuanced portrayal of Jewish family life, told through the eyes of a Gentile. Which is in a different way than I can recall seeing previously in a work of literature, certainly in a work of children's literature. And I was really moved by this book in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I think part of it is because it is kind of refreshing to read a Jewish book that isn't about either, neurotic, damaging Jewish mothers or the Holocaust. And, well, nobody would say, of course, that, literature is supposed to be positive all the time, far be it from me to even suggest such a thing. On the other hand, it doesn't hurt, right? I don't know. Adam, what do you think?
I think one cynical answer would be that no work of fiction of any kind could get the same kind of response now, because people just don't pay as much attention to literary fiction as they used to. I think that...
Oh, Cat Person.
What's that?
There's Cat Person.
Yeah, that's right. Cat Person was the exception. But even when her book, Kristen Rapinian's book, came out, I don't think that it made much of a splash. I think that the days when a novel would be the thing that everyone was talking about seem to be over pretty much, with some exceptions. But
so what about Jewish TV, right? TV is what everybody's talking about.
Yeah, there's
the TV Diesel.
There's a vogue, right? Like Fauda and I just recently saw the new Borat movie, and that's another good example of clandestine Jewish humor, because in fact he's literally speaking Hebrew the entire time, when he's supposed to be speaking Kazakh.
Right, when he's not speaking Polish, he also mixes Polish in there.
Is there some Polish in there?
So there's this. When he says "Jak się masz," that's Polish for "How are you?"
So there's these long stretches of dialogue where I don't know Hebrew well enough to follow it, and completely understand it, but I recognize that he was speaking Hebrew, and that's something that no one is going to get unless they happen to be familiar with Hebrew. So he sort of smuggled it in there. One thing that maybe ties this up a little bit is a writer who's not in my book and never in any canon lists is Herman Wouk, or Wouk. How would you say it, Ruth? How do you say Wouk or Wouk?
I think you say Wouk.
Wouk, okay.
Maybe that's just because he's so the antithesis of being woke.
Right, he's pre-woke. He is probably, in terms of sales, a more popular Jewish writer than almost any of the other ones that we've been talking about today. And he did write about Judaism in a much more positive way, a very affirmative way about Israel and about the Holocaust. And in Marjorie Morningstar, which was a very popular book, he has this whole saga about a young woman who is tempted to give up being Jewish, and in the end she decides she's going to become a housewife in the suburbs, and belong to a synagogue and live a very ordinary life, and that's the happy ending, which wouldn't be a happy ending in a book by almost any other American Jewish writers. So, and he's very beloved and popular. So I think that maybe part of this has to do with what critics like to think and talk about, or things that are subversive and critical rather than things that are affirmative.
Well, let's take one last question from somebody who also will be familiar to us both, who asks, in Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates discusses how hurtful it was to encounter Saul Bellows' question, who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus? What do you think is the future of mid-20th century Jewish literature that is overtly sexist, such as Portnoy's Complaint, or racially offensive, such as Mr. Sandler's Planet? Are such books destined to be cast out of the American fictional canon, and should they be?
Good question.
Right.
That's from my wife who's in the next room. So it's
You don't
it
say.
beamed up to outer space and then came back to the living room. What do you think, Ruth?
Well, I think this is a tough one. I mean, yeah, the Tolstoy of the Zulus, it's interesting. I mean, obviously Ta-Nehisi Coates is not Zulu, but identifies with the obvious racism behind, and lack of any kind of cultural context for the work that is implicit in that question. I mean, I think on the one hand, those works are reflective of something real in American Judaism, especially in the 50s and 60s, right? There's a lot of racism in that community. And, the work, whether or not the works are themselves racist or sexist, I think is a question that reasonable people can probably debate, at least to a certain extent. I mean, I know there are people who, there are female readers who don't find Philip Roth sexist. I'm not one of them, but I do understand that people can have different opinions about this. They certainly tell us something about the culture. Does that make them? What the question of whether their racism and sexism delegitimates them as literature, I think, is a question that's not limited in any way to Jewish literature, and gets into a whole bunch of larger issues that affect our culture in general. In terms of the characters of the creators, and the political implications and the political effects of the works of art that we consume.
Yeah. I think Mr. Sandler's Planet is a fascinating book that I have read many times and thought about a lot, because I think it's a really amazing book, and also definitely racist. I mean, undeniably. So to me, one of the interesting questions is, how did Bellow get to a point where he uses one particular Black character, the pickpocket, who victimizes Mr. Sandler, basically in just the same way as a Nazi propaganda attack on Jews, as a sort of sexual deviant and a representation of everything that's wrong with civilization and the decay of the West. All the things that used to be pinned on Jews, he pins on this Black pickpocket. Why is it that he didn't realize that he was doing that? Why did he not understand sort of the equivalence of that? It's definitely an important question and worth thinking about. But I mean, I would say that more generally, the fact that someone has the wrong opinions or is a bad person, or their work represents bad values, doesn't injure its importance as literature, as long as the thing that's being expressed is being truly expressed. It's of value, it's interesting. That doesn't mean that you agree with it or like it or would want to emulate it, and that's certainly true of almost most works of literature in one way or another. What matters is that the person is expressing something authentic about themselves and about their world, including the bad parts.
Well, I think that's ending on this note of expressing something authentic about their world is a great place for us to stop. Seeing as we are out of time, this part of these Zoom events is always so awkward, because it's it's so weird to just say goodbye with the press of a button. But I really enjoyed speaking with you about this, Adam.
Yeah, this was wonderful, and thank you for coming and listening to us tonight.
Ruth and Adam, thank you both so much from the bookstore's perspective. This was a really enriching and enlightening conversation. We're trying to remind everyone that it's back in the chat again, links to both Adam and Ruth's book. We're really, really grateful to have such robust discussions about so much literature that I couldn't even begin to put all the titles in the chat, but some of them are in there as well as a reference. And I wish you both a really good evening. Thanks for elucidating a topic for us so thoroughly. Really nice to talk to you both.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.